At Riverside Children's Medical Center, volunteer coordinator Edward Smith arrives each morning at 6:30, his worn canvas bag filled with children's books, and the kind of quiet determination that comes from understanding pain. What he doesn't know is that today, a simple request from a lonely little girl will reveal an extraordinary secret that will change not just one life, but transform the very nature of storytelling forever. When two worlds collide, one of humble service, another of unimaginable literary success, an act of kindness will unlock a truth so powerful it will reshape everything they thought they knew about the magic hidden in plain sight. Before we dive into this incredible journey, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if stories of unexpected kindness move you, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have something absolutely extraordinary waiting for you. The fluorescent lights of Riverside Children's Medical Center cast their familiar glow across the polished floors as Edward Smith pushed through the main entrance, his canvas messenger bag heavy with the day's cargo of hope. 24 years old, with kind brown eyes and hands that always seemed to be in motion, Edward had been volunteering at the hospital for 18 months, ever since graduating from community college with a degree in early childhood education that hadn't yet translated into steady employment. His morning routine never varied. Check in with the volunteer coordinator's office, review the day's patient list, and begin his rounds through the pediatric ward with a collection of books that had seen better days but still held worlds of adventure between their worn covers. Edward had discovered something remarkable during his time at Riverside. The right story, told at the right moment, could transport a sick child far from the sterile walls and beeping machines that define their daily reality. Edward's own childhood had been marked by frequent hospital visits when his younger sister battled childhood asthma. He remembered the endless hours of waiting, the fear that seemed to permeate every corner of medical facilities, and, most vividly, he remembered the volunteers who had taken time to read to him while his parents focused on his sister's care. Those moments of escape into fictional worlds had planted a seed that now bloomed into his daily mission at Riverside. His first stop was always the nurse's station, where head nurse Patricia Donovan would update him on which children might benefit most from a storytelling visit. "Morning, sunshine," Patricia called out. "We've got some new faces today. Room 322 has a little girl, maybe 7 years old, admitted yesterday with pneumonia complications. Parents are overseas, military family, and she's been asking for her grandmother who can't travel right now." Edward nodded, making a mental note. "What's her name?" "Zara Mitchell. Sweet kid, but she's been pretty quiet since admission. Might respond well to some stories." Patricia looked up with a softening expression. "And Edward?" The night shift mentioned she was asking specifically about fairy tales. Something about wanting to hear about brave princesses who saved themselves. Edward's volunteer work wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't well paid. In fact, it wasn't paid at all. But it filled a need in his soul that his part-time job at Moonbeam Coffee Shop couldn't touch. At the coffee shop, he served lattes and smiled at customers who barely acknowledged his existence. Here at Riverside, he served hope and watched as children's faces lit up with possibility. As Edward made his way down the corridor toward room 322, he passed the family lounge where a man sat alone, hunched over a laptop computer. He was middle-aged, perhaps in his early 50s, with salt and pepper hair that needed a trim, and clothes that suggested he'd been at the hospital for longer than intended. Edward had noticed him before over the past few days, always in the same spot, always working intently on his computer, while occasionally glancing toward the corridor that led to the patient rooms. Room 322 was quiet when Edward knocked gently on the doorframe. A small voice called out, "Come in," and Edward stepped inside to find a little girl with large, solemn eyes sitting up in bed. "Hi there," Edward said softly, settling into the chair beside Zara's bed. "I'm Edward. I heard you might like to hear some stories." Zara's eyes lit up for the first time since Edward had entered the room. "Really? You brought books?" "Can you read me a story?" she asked, her voice carrying a hopeful note that made Edward's heart squeeze with both joy and protective tenderness. "Absolutely," Edward replied, reaching into his bag. "That's exactly why I'm here." As Edward opened the first book and began to read, neither he nor Zara noticed the man in the family lounge pause in his typing, his attention caught by the sound of Edward's expressive voice carrying down the corridor. In that moment, 3 lives were about to intersect in ways none of them could possibly imagine. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 3 days had passed since Edward first met Zara, and their daily storytelling sessions had become the highlight of both their routines. It was Thursday morning when everything changed. Edward was making his usual rounds when he heard something that made him stop mid-step in the corridor. The sound was coming from the family lounge. Not the typical hushed conversations or phone calls he'd grown accustomed to, but deep, wrenching sobs that spoke of profound grief and exhaustion. The man he'd noticed over the past several days, the one with the salt and pepper hair who was always working on his laptop, sat with his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with the force of his emotion. His computer screen glowed beside him, forgotten and scattered across the small table were what appeared to be printed pages covered in red ink corrections. Edward approached carefully, his volunteer training kicking in. "Excuse me," he said softly, settling into a chair at a respectful distance. "Are you okay? Can I get you some water, or maybe call someone for you?" The man looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and filled with desperation. "I'm sorry," he said, attempting to compose himself. "I didn't realize anyone was here. I don't know what to do anymore." Edward recognized the look. He'd seen it on the faces of countless family members who'd reached the end of their emotional reserves. "It's okay," he said gently. "Sometimes hospitals can be overwhelming. Is someone you love here?" The man nodded, wiping his eyes. "My daughter. She's been sick for a long time, and nothing seems to help. The doctors are wonderful, but—" He gestured helplessly at his laptop screen. "I keep trying to work, to maintain some normalcy, but I can't concentrate. I can't write anything that matters when she's suffering like this." "I'm Edward," he said, offering what he hoped was a reassuring smile. "I volunteer here, reading to the children. What's your name?" "Jonathan," he replied, then paused. "Jonathan Rivers. And I don't know if this sounds strange, but I've been listening to you read to the children. Your voice carries down the hallway, and it's beautiful, the way you bring the stories to life." Edward felt a flush of warmth at the unexpected compliment. "Thank you. I love reading to them. Stories have a way of taking us somewhere else when we need it most." Jonathan's expression shifted, becoming more intent. "That's exactly what I mean. My daughter, she used to love stories. Before she got sick, I would read to her every night. But now she barely speaks. She won't let me read to her anymore. She says the stories remind her of when she was normal." "How old is she?" 9. Her name is Lily." Jonathan looked toward the corridor. "She's in room 327, end-stage leukemia. We've been here for 2 weeks, and she's given up. On the stories, on treatment, on everything." Edward felt a familiar tug in his chest. "Jonathan, would it help if I tried talking to her? Sometimes children respond differently to strangers than to their parents." Jonathan's eyes filled with fresh tears, but this time they seemed to carry a spark of hope. "Would you? I mean, I don't want to force her, but maybe if she heard you reading to other children first, she might be curious." "I have an idea," Edward said. "What if I made my reading sessions a little louder tomorrow? Sometimes children become interested when they're eavesdropping rather than being directly approached." For the first time since Edward had seen him, Jonathan smiled. "That's brilliant. She always was a curious kid. Maybe curiosity will succeed where everything else has failed." As Edward gathered his things to continue his rounds, he noticed Jonathan's laptop screen more clearly. The document displayed was titled, Chapter 23, The Garden of Lost Dreams, and the pages scattered on the table were covered with sophisticated writing and character development notes. "You're a writer?" Edward asked, genuine interest in his voice. Jonathan nodded, his expression becoming almost embarrassed. "I try to be. Nothing too important. Just stories, really. I've been working on a series about children who discover magic in ordinary places. Ironic, isn't it? I write about magic helping children, but I can't seem to find any magic to help my own daughter." Edward felt something click into place, though he couldn't quite identify what it was. "Stories are magic, Jonathan. Sometimes it just takes the right moment for the spell to work." What Edward didn't know was that his simple act of kindness toward a grieving father was about to unlock a secret that would change not just Lily's world, but the entire landscape of children's literature forever. The next morning arrived with gentle autumn sunlight filtering through Riverside's large windows. Edward had spent most of the previous evening carefully selecting his books for the day, choosing stories with particularly vivid descriptions and engaging dialogue that would naturally project down the hallway. His first stop was Zara's room, where the little girl was sitting up in bed, looking significantly brighter. "Edward!" Zara called out with genuine excitement. "I've been waiting for you. I had the most amazing dream last night about the princess from yesterday's story." Edward smiled, settling into his familiar chair. "Of course we can read more. But first I want to try something a little different today. Would you mind if I read a bit louder than usual? I want to make sure the story really comes alive." Zara's eyes sparkled with curiosity. "Why louder?" "Well," Edward said, lowering his voice conspiratorially, "sometimes other children in nearby rooms might want to hear stories too, but they're too shy to ask. If we read louder, maybe they can enjoy the adventure with us, even from their own beds." The little girl nodded enthusiastically. "Like a secret story broadcast." "That's brilliant, Edward. Let's do it." Edward opened the book and began reading with deliberate clarity and expression, his voice carrying just enough to reach beyond the confines of room 322. He found himself naturally falling into a more theatrical style of delivery, creating distinct voices for different characters and allowing the emotional beats of the story to resonate more fully. After finishing the chapter, Edward and Zara discussed the story, but Edward's attention was partially focused on the hallway beyond. He was listening for any signs of interest from room 327. "Edward," Zara said suddenly, "there's a girl down the hall who's been listening. I saw her yesterday when I went for my walk. She was standing in her doorway, but she ducked back inside when she saw me looking." Edward's heart quickened. "Really? Which room?" "The one at the very end. 327, I think." She looked sad, but also like she wanted to come closer. Zara's expression grew thoughtful. Maybe she's scared to ask for stories because she thinks she's too old or something. Edward spent the next hour making his rounds to other rooms, each time reading with the same enhanced volume and expression. It was during his third reading session that Edward finally saw her. A figure appeared briefly in the doorway of room 327, clearly engaged with the story, before disappearing back into the room. Edward's pulse quickened with excitement and hope. Jonathan had been right. Curiosity was proving stronger than withdrawal. After finishing his morning rounds, Edward made his way back toward the family lounge, hoping to update Jonathan on the promising development. He found him in his usual spot, but this time his laptop was closed, and he was staring out the window with profound sadness. "Jonathan?" Edward approached carefully. "How are you doing today?" He turned with a wan smile. "Edward, I was hoping I'd see you. I wanted to thank you for yesterday, for listening, for caring." "It meant more than you know." He paused. "Lily had a rough night. The doctors they're talking about adjusting her treatment plan again." Edward felt his heart sink. "I'm so sorry. But Jonathan, I have something to tell you that might lift your spirits, even just a little." He described the morning's events, Zara's observations, the listening figure in the doorway, the clear signs that Lily was at least curious about the stories being told down the hall. As Edward spoke, he watched Jonathan's expression gradually shift from despair to something that looked cautiously like hope. "She was listening?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Really listening?" "For almost 10 minutes during the last story. She didn't come closer, but she didn't leave either. That's huge progress, Jonathan." Jonathan's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. "I can't tell you what this means to me. She hasn't shown interest in anything for weeks." "Jonathan, would you mind if I tried a more direct approach tomorrow? Nothing pushy, just maybe walking past her room while reading aloud, or perhaps stopping in the hallway right outside her door?" "You would do that?" "Of course I would, but I want to be strategic about it. What kinds of stories did she love before she got sick?" Jonathan's face lit up as he began describing his daughter's literary preferences. She loved stories about ordinary children who discovered they had special powers or found magical worlds hidden in everyday places. She was obsessed with books about kids who felt different or misunderstood, but then found out they were actually extraordinary. Edward nodded, already formulating a plan. "I have the perfect book in mind. It's about a girl who thinks she's ordinary, but discovers she can hear the stories that places want to tell. Old houses, forgotten gardens, abandoned playgrounds." "That sounds exactly like something she would have loved," Jonathan said, his voice thick with emotion. "Don't do that," Edward said firmly but gently. "She's still here, still fighting, still capable of loving stories. Sometimes hope requires us to believe in possibilities even when they seem impossible. As if on cue, Edward's phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. The girl in 327 asked me about the man who reads stories. She wanted to know if you read books about magic. Edward showed the message to Jonathan, watching as his face transformed with pure joy. She asked about you, he breathed. She actually asked about stories and magic. Tomorrow, Edward said with quiet determination, I'm going to station myself right outside her door with the most magical story I can find. And Jonathan? I have a feeling that your daughter is about to remember why she fell in love with stories in the first place. What neither Edward nor Jonathan realized was that Lily Rivers had been listening not just to the stories, but to their conversations in the family lounge. And for the first time in weeks, Lily felt something stirring inside her chest. Something that felt dangerously close to curiosity and perhaps even the faintest whisper of hope. Holostomist. Edward woke at 5:30 the next morning with his stomach twisted in knots. As he lay in his small studio apartment, staring at the ceiling where early morning light filtered through thin curtains, he found himself questioning everything about the plan he'd made with Jonathan. He'd spent hours the previous evening selecting the perfect book, The Memory Keeper by Adelaide Winters, a story about a girl who could hear the forgotten tales that objects and places longed to share. But now, holding the book in his hands as he sat on the edge of his bed, Edward felt the weight of responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. What if he made things worse? What if his intrusion into Lily's carefully constructed emotional barriers caused the girl to retreat even further? Edward had seen it happen before, well-meaning adults pushing too hard, too fast, causing vulnerable children to shut down completely. He made his coffee with trembling hands, spilling grounds across his small kitchen counter and burning his tongue on the first sip. His phone buzzed with a text from his supervisor at Moonbeam Coffee Shop. "Can you pick up an extra shift today?" Jenna called in sick. Edward stared at the message, feeling a moment of wild relief. Here was a perfect excuse to avoid the hospital entirely, to postpone the confrontation with Lily until he felt more prepared. He started to type "Yes, I'll be right there," but stopped with his finger hovering over the send button. The image of Jonathan's face yesterday, the desperate hope mixed with grief, floated through his mind. Could Edward really let his own fears override a child's potential breakthrough? But what if he wasn't qualified for this kind of intervention? Edward's volunteer training had covered basic interaction with pediatric patients, but dealing with a child who had given up on life felt far beyond his expertise. He was 24 years old with a community college degree and 18 months of volunteer experience. What made him think he could succeed where trained medical professionals had struggled? Edward set his phone down without responding to the text and instead called his former supervisor from college, Dr. Rebecca Hartwell, who had taught the childhood development courses that had inspired Edward's volunteer work. "Edward," Dr. Hartwell's warm voice filled the phone. "What a lovely surprise. How are you, dear?" I'm not sure," Edward admitted, sinking into his small couch. He explained the situation with Lily, his growing relationship with Jonathan, and his mounting fears about overstepping his boundaries. Dr. Hartwell listened without interruption. "You're facing what every caring professional encounters," Dr. Hartwell said when Edward finished. "The tension between wanting to help and fearing you might cause harm. But Edward, let me ask you something. What's the worst thing that happens if you try and Lily rejects your approach?" Edward considered this. She retreats further, loses the small progress she's made, maybe becomes even more resistant to help from others. And what's the worst thing that happens if you don't try? The question hit Edward like a physical blow. She continues to fade away, loses all connection to the things that once brought her joy, and she gives up completely. "Which scenario do you think you could live with?" Dr. Hartwell asked gently. Edward closed his eyes, feeling the truth settle over him. He could live with trying and failing. He couldn't live with not trying at all. After ending the call, Edward felt marginally better, but his anxiety hadn't completely disappeared. As he sat there, picking at his toast, another wave of doubt crashed over him. His phone rang, interrupting his spiraling thoughts. The caller ID showed Riverside's number. "Edward, it's Patricia." The head nurse's voice carried an unusual note of urgency. "I hate to call you at home, but we had an incident this morning with the girl in 327. She asked the night nurse specifically about you, when you'd be coming in, whether you were bringing the magic storybook today." When the nurse couldn't give her a definite answer, she became quite upset. Edward's heart began racing. Upset how? Crying, asking if you'd changed your mind about helping her, whether her father had scared you away by talking too much. Patricia paused. Edward, I've never seen this child show this much emotional engagement about anything since her admission. She's usually completely passive, but this morning she's been watching the hallway constantly, asking everyone who passes whether they've seen you. The weight of Lily's expectations settled on Edward's shoulders like a physical burden. Patricia, Edward said slowly, what if I make things worse? What if I'm not qualified to handle a child who's this fragile? There was a long pause before Patricia responded. Edward, in my 28 years as a pediatric nurse, I've learned something important. Sometimes the most healing thing you can offer a child isn't professional expertise. It's genuine caring and authentic connection. This little girl has been surrounded by medical professionals for weeks, and none of us have reached her the way your simple storytelling has. Edward stared out his apartment window at the brightening morning sky. Somewhere across the city, a 9-year-old girl was waiting for him, hoping for magic in the form of stories read by someone who cared enough to try. I'll be there in an hour, Edward said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. As he gathered his things and selected his books, Edward realized that his fear hadn't disappeared. It had simply been overruled by something stronger. Sometimes courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was acting in spite of fear because something more important was at stake. Edward grabbed his canvas bag and, the memory keeper, took a deep breath and headed out to discover whether his simple stories could work the kind of magic that really mattered. Edward arrived at Riverside Children's Medical Center 45 minutes later, his canvas bag clutched tightly against his chest. Patricia was waiting for him at the nurse's station, her expression a mixture of relief and anticipation. Thank goodness you're here, she said, glancing toward the far end of the corridor where room 327 lay. She's been asking about you every 20 minutes since 7 o'clock. Patricia's face grew serious. Edward, I need to be honest with you about something. The doctors had a conference yesterday evening about Lily's case. Her father doesn't know yet. They're planning to speak with him later today, but her latest test results aren't encouraging. The words hit Edward like a cold wave. What does that mean? It means that whatever connection you can make with her, whatever joy you can bring into her world right now, it matters more than you might realize. Patricia's eyes were kind but serious. I wanted you to understand why her interest in stories feels so significant to all of us. Edward nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle even more heavily on his shoulders. But instead of increasing his anxiety, Patricia's words seemed to crystallize his resolve. If Lily's time might be limited, then every moment of happiness, every spark of engagement, every connection to the magical world of stories became infinitely precious. Edward made his way through his morning rounds with a heightened sense of purpose. He began with Zara, whose grandmother had arrived the previous evening and was now sitting beside her bed. Edward positioned himself so that his voice would carry clearly down the hallway as he read from The Memory Keeper. Sarah had always thought she was ordinary, Edward read with particular emphasis, until the day she realized she could hear the stories that forgotten places desperately wanted to tell. The old oak tree in her backyard whispered tales of children who had climbed its branches decades ago. As Edward continued reading, he became aware of unusual quiet in the hallway. Several nurses had paused in their rounds, clearly drawn to the story. More importantly, he could sense an attentive presence from the direction of room 327. After finishing the chapter with Zara, Edward moved to Timothy's room, deliberately choosing a path that would take him past room 327. As he approached, he slowed his pace and raised his voice slightly. I wonder, he said to no one in particular, if I should read the part about the girl who discovers that being different isn't a curse, it's actually the source of all her magic. Sometimes the things that make us feel most alone are the very things that make us most special. From the corner of his eye, Edward saw movement in the doorway of room 327. Not wanting to break the spell by looking directly, he continued walking slowly while speaking to the air. Of course, the girl in the story had to be very brave to accept her gift. It's scary to believe in magic when everyone around you says it doesn't exist. But sometimes the bravest thing you can do is listen to the part of your heart that still believes in impossible things. Edward heard the soft sound of footsteps, and when he reached the end of the hallway, he turned around to find a thin figure standing in the doorway of room 327. Lily Rivers was even smaller than Edward had imagined, her dark hair falling in waves around a pale face dominated by large, serious eyes. She wore a hospital gown decorated with tiny stars. For a moment, neither of them moved. Edward felt his heart pounding as he took in the sight of this child who had been consuming his thoughts for days. Lily looked fragile but alert, curious but cautious. Edward made a decision that felt both natural and terrifying. Instead of approaching Lily directly, he settled himself on the floor in the hallway, about 15 feet from room 327, and opened The Memory Keeper to a carefully selected chapter. "I was just about to read my favorite part of this story," Edward said, addressing his words to the space between them rather than directly to Lily. "It's about a girl who thinks she's lost all her magic, but then discovers that magic doesn't disappear. It just sometimes hides until we're ready to see it again." Edward began reading, his voice clear and expressive but not demanding. He created voices for different characters and allowed the emotional rhythms of the story to flow naturally. He was acutely aware of Lily's presence in the doorway but forced himself not to look up. The story was about Sarah, the memory keeper, visiting a children's hospital where she discovered that the building itself held thousands of stories, tales of courage, hope, healing, and love that had accumulated over decades of caring for sick children. "The hospital walls hummed with bravery," Edward read, letting his voice carry the full emotional weight of the passage. Sarah could hear the whispers of children who had fought battles much bigger than themselves, who had found strength they never knew they possessed. The building itself had become magical, not because of fairy godmothers or wizard spells, but because of the real magic that happens when people refuse to give up on hope. As Edward read, he became aware that other listeners had gathered. Zara's grandmother had wheeled Zara's bed closer to the hallway. Timothy had convinced his nurse to let him sit in a wheelchair near his doorway. But Edward's primary awareness was focused on the slight figure in the doorway of room 327, who had gradually moved from leaning against the doorframe to sitting cross-legged just outside her room. When Edward reached the end of the chapter, he closed the book softly and looked up for the first time to make direct eye contact with Lily. The little girl's eyes were bright with tears, but her expression wasn't one of sadness, it was wonder. "That was beautiful," Lily said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the hushed hallway. Do you think this hospital has stories like that?" Edward felt his heart expand with hope and possibility. "I think this hospital has some of the most amazing stories in the world," he said gently. "Stories about brave children and the people who love them. Stories about magic that happens every day, even when it doesn't look like the magic in fairy tales." Lily was quiet for a long moment, considering this. Then she asked, Would you maybe like to read more of that book? I could listen from here if that's okay." Edward smiled, feeling as though something precious and fragile had just been placed in his hands. "I would love to read more of this book. And Lily, you can listen from wherever feels comfortable to you." As Edward opened the book to the next chapter, he caught sight of movement in the family lounge. Jonathan Rivers stood in the doorway, tears streaming down his face as he watched his daughter voluntarily engaging with stories for the first time in weeks. Edward began reading again, his voice steady and warm, knowing that something fundamental had just shifted. The threshold had been crossed, the connection made, and now anything seemed possible. Over the following week, Edward's storytelling sessions with Lily evolved into something neither of them had expected. What began as tentative listening from a doorway had transformed into a daily ritual that seemed to breathe new life into the entire pediatric ward. Lily had gradually moved closer, first sitting just outside her room, then in the hallway proper, and finally accepting Edward's invitation to sit beside him on a portable cushion. But progress, Edward was learning, rarely followed a straight line. On Tuesday, Lily had been so engaged with the story that she'd actually laughed out loud when the Memory Keeper character discovered that a grumpy old garden gnome had been composing poetry about the flowers for decades. The sound of her laughter had drawn smiles from every staff member within earshot, and Jonathan had stood in the family lounge wiping away tears of joy. On Wednesday, however, Lily had experienced what Dr. Martinez, her oncologist, clinically termed a difficult day. The treatment had left her nauseated and exhausted, and when Edward arrived for their usual session, he found Lily curled in her bed, face turned toward the wall, completely unresponsive to gentle attempts at conversation. Edward had sat quietly in the chair beside Lily's bed for nearly an hour, not reading, not talking, simply being present. Sometimes, he'd learned, the most powerful thing you could offer someone wasn't entertainment or distraction, but the gift of witnessed silence. Finally, Lily had turned over and whispered, "Could you maybe just read very quietly? I can't look at the pictures today, but I could listen." Thursday brought a new challenge entirely. Edward arrived to find Lily's room crowded with medical equipment that hadn't been there the day before. Monitors beeped with increased frequency, and there were additional IV lines that spoke of treatment complications Edward didn't fully understand. "What's happening?" Edward asked Patricia when he found her updating charts at the nurse's station. Patricia glanced around before answering quietly. "Her body isn't responding to the current treatment protocol as well as they'd hoped. Dr. Martinez is recommending they try a more aggressive approach, but—" She hesitated. "It would mean several days of intensive treatment that would leave her very weak. Jonathan is struggling with the decision." Edward felt something cold settle in his stomach. The aggressive treatment might buy them more time, but it would also be extremely difficult for her to endure. Quality of life versus quantity of life. It's an impossible choice for any parent. Patricia looked toward room 327. "Jonathan asked me to tell you that Lily has been asking for her story session, even though she's not feeling well." Edward made his way to room 327, with his heart heavy but his resolve firm. He found Lily propped up in bed, looking smaller and more fragile than ever, but her eyes lit up when Edward appeared in the doorway. "Edward!" Lily's voice was weaker than usual, but genuine enthusiasm rang through it. "I was hoping you'd come. I had the strangest dream about the memory keeper last night, and I wanted to tell you about it." As Edward settled into his chair, he noticed Jonathan watching from the corner of the room, his face etched with exhaustion. Edward gave him what he hoped was an encouraging smile before turning his full attention to Lily. "Tell me about your dream," Edward said, pulling out his notebook, a new addition to their routine that Lily had requested for recording important story thoughts. "Well," Lily began, her eyes growing brighter as she spoke, "I dreamed that the memory keeper came to this hospital, just like in the story you read yesterday. But when she listened to the building's stories, she discovered something amazing." Edward leaned forward, genuinely curious. What did she discover? "She found out that every sick child who had ever stayed here had left behind a little piece of their bravery, hidden in the walls like secret treasures. And when new children arrived who were scared or sad, they could somehow absorb that leftover courage and use it to help them be brave too." Edward felt his throat tighten with emotion. "That's a beautiful dream, Lily. What happened next?" The memory keeper realized that she wasn't just collecting stories. She was helping to weave them together, creating this invisible web of courage that connected all the children across time. So even when kids felt alone, they weren't really alone, because they were part of this huge network of bravery. Jonathan had moved closer during Lily's recounting, and Edward could see tears gathering in his eyes. The profound wisdom in his daughter's dream was both heartbreaking and inspiring. "Lily," Edward said carefully, "do you think you might be part of that network of bravery?" Lily considered this seriously. "I think maybe I'm still learning how to be brave. Sometimes I feel brave, like when I'm listening to stories, or when I convince myself that the treatments might actually work. But other times—" She looked down at her hands. "Other times I feel like I'm not brave at all, like I'm just scared and tired and want everything to stop." Edward felt the weight of the moment, the importance of responding with honesty rather than false cheer. "You know what I think? I think being brave doesn't mean you're never scared or tired. I think it means you keep going even when you are scared and tired. And Lily, you've been doing that every single day." "Really? Really? And you know what else? I think your dream shows that you understand something really important, that we're all connected by our courage, even when we can't see it. Every time you listen to a story, every time you share your thoughts about it, every time you smile even when you don't feel like smiling, you're adding to that network of bravery." Over the next hour, Edward read from the memory keeper while Lily drifted in and out of alertness. During one of Lily's more wakeful moments, she asked, "Edward, do you think the memory keeper ever gets scared that she won't be able to help someone?" The question caught Edward off guard with its perceptiveness. "I think she probably does get scared sometimes. Helping people is a big responsibility, and sometimes you don't know if what you're doing is enough. But she keeps trying anyway. She keeps trying anyway. Lily nodded slowly. That sounds like real bravery to me. Later, as Edward prepared to leave for the day, Jonathan approached him in the hallway. His face showed the strain of the decisions he was facing, but there was something else there too, a deep gratitude. Edward, he said quietly, I wanted you to know that listening to you and Lily talk today helped me understand something important. Whatever medical decisions we face, whatever happens with her treatment, she's already showing a kind of courage that most adults never achieve. Your stories aren't just entertaining her, they're helping her make sense of her experience in a way that gives her power over it. Edward felt tears gathering in his own eyes. She's an extraordinary child, Jonathan. She is. And 1 year later, Elena stood before an audience of 500 pediatric healthcare professionals at the National Children's Hospital Conference. A far cry from the young woman who had once cleaned coffee spills and worried about making rent. The presentation she was about to deliver would officially launch the Rivers Foundation's Story Medicine Initiative, a comprehensive program that had grown from their small beginning at Riverside into a network spanning 87 hospitals across 4 countries. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice steady and confident, I want to tell you about a little girl who taught me that sometimes the most powerful medicine doesn't come in a bottle. It comes from the simple act of sharing stories. In the front row, Lily Rivers sat beside her father, wearing a beautiful blue dress and a radiant smile. Her hair had grown back in soft curls, and the healthy glow in her cheeks spoke of 11 months in complete remission. Beside her sat Dr. Martinez, Patricia, and Mrs. Reyes from Riverside, along with story coordinators from hospitals across the globe who had traveled to witness this moment of recognition and expansion. Edward clicked to his first slide, which showed a photograph of himself reading to Lily in that first hallway storytelling session. This photo was taken during what we now call a hallway intervention, an unplanned moment when a sick child's curiosity overcame her isolation, and a volunteer's willingness to be present created the foundation for everything that followed. The audience listened with rapt attention as Edward shared the data they had collected over the past year. Children participating in the Story Medicine program showed a 37% improvement in treatment compliance, a 42% reduction in anxiety-related symptoms, and most remarkably, a 28% improvement in overall recovery outcomes when compared to control groups. But numbers, Edward continued, can only tell part of the story. The real transformation happens in moments like these. He played a video compilation that the foundation had created, showing children from hospitals around the world sharing their own courage stories. A boy in Toronto described how pretending to be a brave knight helped him get through surgery. A girl in London told the camera about the magic healing stories that helped her sleep through chemotherapy sessions. Twins in Sydney had created an entire fantasy world where sick children were actually heroes in training, learning special powers that would help them save others. Each of these children discovered what Lily Rivers taught us from the beginning, Edward said, gesturing toward Lily, who waved cheerfully at the audience. That stories don't just entertain us, they transform us. They give us language for experiences that might otherwise overwhelm us, and they connect us to a network of courage that spans time, distance, and circumstance. Edward advanced to a slide showing the Foundation's current reach, 87 hospitals, over 300 trained story coordinators, and more than 15,000 children who had participated in storytelling programs over the past year. The Rivers Foundation has accomplished something unprecedented, Edward explained. We've created the world's first peer-to-peer network for hospitalized children, where a child fighting cancer in Seattle can share courage stories with a child recovering from surgery in Madrid. Geographic distance and language barriers become irrelevant when children discover they share the universal language of bravery. Jonathan took the stage briefly to announce the Foundation's newest initiative, a partnership with major publishers to create the first collection of stories written specifically by and for children facing medical challenges. The Voices of Courage anthology will feature stories written by young patients from around the world, he explained. These aren't stories about sick children. They're stories by brave heroes who happen to be facing medical battles. As Jonathan spoke, Edward watched Lily in the front row, remembering the frightened little girl who had once asked if she could listen to stories from her doorway. Now Lily was the Foundation's official young ambassador, traveling to hospitals to help launch new programs. and serving as proof that the combination of excellent medical care and emotional support through storytelling could create genuine miracles. After the presentation, Edward found himself surrounded by healthcare professionals eager to bring story medicine programs to their own facilities. Requests came from hospitals in Brazil, Japan, South Africa, and Norway. A representative from UNICEF inquired about adapting the program for refugee children in medical facilities worldwide. Edward, Dr. Foster from Philadelphia, approached with obvious excitement. "We've just received approval to include storytelling interventions in our official treatment protocols. You've helped create a new standard of care." Later that evening, at the Foundation's celebration dinner, Edward sat at a table with the people who had become his chosen family. Lily, now 10 years old and full of the energy that comes with renewed health, was enthusiastically describing her latest story idea to a group of story coordinators from various hospitals. "It's about a girl who discovers that every time she tells a brave story, it plants a seed of courage somewhere in the world," Lily explained. "And eventually, there are so many courage seeds growing that the whole world becomes a little bit braver." Jonathan leaned over to Edward. "You know, I've written dozens of books about magic and transformation, but nothing I ever created comes close to what you and Lily built together." Edward smiled, watching as Lily demonstrated the Foundation's new story-sharing app to interested coordinators. The technology allowed children in different hospitals to record and exchange stories in real time, creating connections that transcended geographic boundaries. "Jonathan," Edward said, "I think we all built this together. Lily taught us about courage. You provided the platform and resources. The medical teams ensured we could help safely, and everyone else." He gestured around the room, filled with story coordinators, doctors, nurses, and hospital administrators. Everyone else proved that when people believe in the power of stories, incredible things become possible. Patricia approached their table carrying a beautifully wrapped package. "This just arrived for you, Edward. The return address says it's from the anonymous donor who's been supporting the Foundation." Edward opened the package to find a leather-bound journal with a note attached, "For recording the stories that haven't been told yet. The world needs more story medicine, and you've proven that one person's kindness can heal thousands. Thank you for showing us all what's possible when we listen to the stories children need to tell." As Edward opened the journal, he found that the first page contained a single sentence written in elegant handwriting. "Once upon a time, a young man heard a child asking for a story, and his answer changed the world." Edward looked around the celebration, taking in the faces of people whose lives had been touched by what had begun as a simple response to a lonely child's request. Story coordinators from around the world were sharing best practices and forming friendships that would support their work for years to come. Medical professionals were discussing research opportunities that could expand their understanding of narrative therapy. Most importantly, children who had been isolated by illness had found their voices and discovered that their stories mattered. Lily appeared beside Edward's chair, carrying a small, wrapped gift. "This is for you," she said with the kind of smile that had become her trademark, radiant, knowing, and full of mischief. Edward unwrapped the gift to find a pendant identical to the ones worn by children in the Story Medicine Network. But this one was special. Instead of an open book, it contained a tiny compass with an inscription around the edge. "Stories lead us home." "Edward," Lily said, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had faced darkness and chosen light, "thank you for teaching me that asking for a story was really asking for hope. And thank you for showing me that hope, when it's shared, becomes powerful enough to change everything." As Edward fastened the pendant around his neck, he realized that they had come full circle. What had begun with a child's simple request, "Can you read me a story?" had evolved into a global movement proving that stories weren't just entertainment, but medicine for the soul. The Foundation would continue to grow, reaching more children and families than Edward could have imagined. But at its heart would always be the truth that Lily had taught him. That sometimes the most profound healing happens not through complex treatments or expensive interventions, but through the simple, powerful act of one person saying to another, "Yes, I'll read you a story." And in hospitals around the world, that answer would continue to echo, creating ripples of hope that would reach children not yet born, stories not yet told, and miracles still waiting to unfold. Sat beside her father, wearing a beautiful blue dress and a radiant smile. Her hair had grown back in soft curls, and the healthy glow in her cheeks spoke of 11 months in complete remission. Beside her sat Dr. Martinez, Patricia, and Mrs. Reyes from Riverside. along with story coordinators from hospitals across the globe who had traveled to witness this moment of recognition and expansion. Elena clicked to her first slide, which showed a photograph of herself reading to Lily in that first hallway storytelling session. This photo was taken during what we now call a hallway intervention, an unplanned moment when a sick child's curiosity overcame her isolation, and a volunteer's willingness to be present created the foundation for everything that followed. The audience listened with rapt attention as Elena shared the data they had collected over the past year. Children participating in the Story Medicine program showed a 37% improvement in treatment compliance, a 42% reduction in anxiety-related symptoms, and, most remarkably, a 28% improvement in overall recovery outcomes when compared to control groups. But numbers, Elena continued, can only tell part of the story. The real transformation happens in moments like these. She played a video compilation that the Foundation had created, showing children from hospitals around the world sharing their own courage stories. A boy in Toronto described how pretending to be a brave knight helped him get through surgery. A girl in London told the camera about the magic healing stories that helped her sleep through chemotherapy sessions. Twins in Sydney had created an entire fantasy world where sick children were actually heroes in training, learning special powers that would help them save others. Each of these children discovered what Lily Rivers taught us from the beginning, Elena said, gesturing toward Lily, who waved cheerfully at the audience. That stories don't just entertain us, they transform us. They give us language for experiences that might otherwise overwhelm us, and they connect us to a network of courage that spans time, distance, and circumstance. Elena advanced to a slide showing the Foundation's current reach: 87 hospitals, over 300 trained story coordinators, and more than 15,000 children who had participated in storytelling programs over the past year. The Rivers Foundation has accomplished something unprecedented, Elena explained. We've created the world's first peer-to-peer network for hospitalized children, where a child fighting cancer in Seattle can share courage stories with a child recovering from surgery in Madrid. Geographic distance and language barriers become irrelevant when children discover they share the universal language of bravery. Jonathan took the stage briefly to announce the Foundation's newest initiative, a partnership with major publishers to create the first collection of stories written specifically by and for children facing medical challenges. The Voices of Courage anthology will feature stories written by young patients from around the world, he explained. These aren't stories about sick children. They're stories by brave heroes who happen to be facing medical battles. As Jonathan spoke, Elena watched Lily in the front row, remembering the frightened little girl who had once asked if she could listen to stories from her doorway. Now Lily was the Foundation's official young ambassador, traveling to hospitals to help launch new programs and serving as proof that the combination of excellent medical care and emotional support through storytelling could create genuine miracles. After the presentation, Elena found herself surrounded by healthcare professionals, eager to bring story medicine programs to their own facilities. Requests came from hospitals in Brazil, Japan, South Africa, and Norway. A representative from UNICEF inquired about adapting the program for refugee children in medical facilities worldwide. Elena, Dr. Foster from Philadelphia, approached with obvious excitement. We've just received approval to include storytelling interventions in our official treatment protocols. You've helped create a new standard of care. Later that evening, at the Foundation's celebration dinner, Elena sat at a table with the people who had become her chosen family. Lily, now 10 years old and full of the energy that comes with renewed health, was enthusiastically describing her latest story idea to a group of story coordinators from various hospitals. It's about a girl who discovers that every time she tells a brave story, it plants a seed of courage somewhere in the world, Lily explained. And eventually there are so many courage seeds growing that the whole world becomes a little bit braver. Jonathan leaned over to Elena. You know, I've written dozens of books about magic and transformation, but nothing I ever created comes close to what you and Lily built together. Elena smiled, watching as Lily demonstrated the Foundation's new story-sharing app to interested coordinators. The technology allowed children in different hospitals to record and exchange stories in real time, creating connections that transcended geographic boundaries. Jonathan, Elena said, I think we all built this together. Lily taught us about courage. You provided the platform and resources. The medical teams ensured we could help safely. And everyone else. She gestured around the room filled with story coordinators, doctors, nurses, and hospital administrators. Everyone else proved that when people believe in the power of stories, incredible things become possible. Patricia approached their table carrying a beautifully wrapped package. "This just arrived for you, Elena." The return address says it's from the anonymous donor who's been supporting the foundation. Elena opened the package to find a leather-bound journal with a note attached. "For recording the stories that haven't been told yet. The world needs more story medicine, and you've proven that one person's kindness can heal thousands. Thank you for showing us all what's possible when we listen to the stories children need to tell." As Elena opened the journal, she found that the first page contained a single sentence written in elegant handwriting. "Once upon a time, a young woman heard a child asking for a story, and her answer changed the world." Elena looked around the celebration, taking in the faces of people whose lives had been touched by what had begun as a simple response to a lonely child's request. Story coordinators from around the world were sharing best practices and forming friendships that would support their work for years to come. Medical professionals were discussing research opportunities that could expand their understanding of narrative therapy. Most importantly, children who had been isolated by illness had found their voices and discovered that their stories mattered. Lily appeared beside Elena's chair, carrying a small, wrapped gift. "This is for you," she said with the kind of smile that had become her trademark, radiant, knowing, and full of mischief. Elena unwrapped the gift to find a pendant identical to the ones worn by children in the Story Medicine Network, but this one was special. Instead of an open book, it contained a tiny compass with an inscription around the edge. "Stories lead us home." "Elena," Lily said, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had faced darkness and chosen light. "Thank you for teaching me that asking for a story was really asking for hope. And thank you for showing me that hope, when it's shared, becomes powerful enough to change everything." As Elena fastened the pendant around her neck, she realized that they had come full circle. What had begun with a child's simple request, "Can you read me a story?" had evolved into a global movement, proving that stories weren't just entertainment, but medicine for the soul. The foundation would continue to grow, reaching more children and families than Elena could have imagined, but at its heart would always be the truth that Lily had taught her. That sometimes the most profound healing happens not through complex treatments or expensive interventions, but through the simple, powerful act of one person saying to another, "Yes, I'll read you a story." Huntry. And in hospitals around the world, that answer would continue to echo, creating ripples of hope that would reach children not yet born, stories not yet told, and miracles still waiting to unfold. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.